Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Jennifer Franklin. I'm the program director of the Hudson Valley Writers Center. I'm so happy to have you with us today for this in-person reading with Sandra Newman and Ed Park. If this is your first time joining us for a reading, welcome. We hope you continue to come to our online readings, our in-person classes, readings, and events. Please check out our website for the complete list of all of our offerings. We hope you will return to the Hudson Valley Writers Center for our next fiction reading on Sunday, September 8th, as we welcome Helen Phillips and Thomas Grattan. Please save the date as well for the Hudson Valley Writers Center Gala on Friday, September 20th, when we will welcome Stacy Schiff to read from her book on Benjamin Franklin, or another one of her, maybe her Pulitzer Prize winning book on Cleopatra. We're not sure. Ellen will let us know exactly what she's going to be reading from as it gets closer to the date. I want to thank the board of directors, especially our board chair, Mary Linder, who's here today over there, our teachers, our students who are the beating heart of the center. We also want to recognize the foundations and the organizations who support us, including NISCA and Arts Westchester. Arts Westchester gives us funding for most of our scholarships, which we're very grateful for. I also want to thank my colleagues, Sophia Bannister, Misty Yarnell, Christina Papadopoulos, and Leslie Zinna, and our new intern, Sarah Feldman. They're both here today. And Ellen Archer, our new interim executive director, who's also here today for all of their hard work. Now it is my honor to introduce Sandra Newman and Ed Park. Sandra Newman is the author of the novels The Only Good Thing Anyone Has Ever Done, nominated for the 2002 Guardian First Book Award. The Men, the Heavens, from which she read here last time, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and The Country of Ice Cream Star, longlisted for the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction and named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post and NPR, as well as many other works of fiction and nonfiction. Her writing has appeared in Harper's and Granta, among other publications. She lives in New York City. Julia has been called a masterpiece and a perfect specimen. To refresh your mind, if you have not read 1984 recently and you have not yet read Julia, Julia Worthing is a mechanic working in the fiction department at the Ministry of Truth. It's 1984 and Britain is now called Airstrip 1. It has been absorbed into the larger transatlantic nation of Oceania, which has been at war for as long as anyone can remember. And it's also ruled by an ultra-totalitarian party, and the head of that is Big Brother. In short, everything in Julia is the same as in Orwell's 1984. One day she finds herself walking toward Winston Smith and slips him a note, setting in motion the devastating, unforgettable events of the classic story. Julia takes us on a surprising journey through Orwell's now iconic dystopia with twists that reveal unexpected sides, not only to Julia, but to other characters in the novel. This unique perspective lays bare our own world in haunting and provocative ways, just as the original did almost 75 years ago. So that's a little intro, so she doesn't have to give you the context for what she's going to read today. This novel speaks to our time, especially in the way the right is successfully stripping women of bodily autonomy. Although I am a poet, my undergraduate concentration at Brown was in modernist fiction, and reading novels when I have the time is still one of my greatest pleasures. One of the novels I have enjoyed most in the past 20 years is Julia. I cannot wait for you to hear Sandra bring you inside of Julia's mind and to discuss her process of writing this amazing novel. Please help me welcome Sandra Newman.
Hi, hello. Okay, I think it's funny. I think Ed and I are both used to reading for a considerably shorter period of time than we've been invited to reading. We're both kind of scrambling, trying to find something that's not 5 minutes long instead of 20 minutes long. So I don't think I'm going to make a full 20 minutes, and we'll probably chat more at the end. But I just like gave up and went to page 1. So here we are at page 1. It's the easiest. I don't have to explain anything that Jennifer hasn't kindly already explained. And we'll see how long I can carry on before I begin to collapse from self-consciousness or make like really simple reading errors. You'd think that you would know how to read as an author, but not always. And it's terrible as well. I'm not one of those authors, the genius authors who can read the audiobook. No one has ever considered like even inviting me to do this. And I actually couldn't do it. It's really true. I would make a mistake in every sentence. So I apologize ahead of time. Pretty quickly, I begin to make reading errors. Now that I've said that, maybe I won't. You know how it is. I'm going to say this at every reading before I start reading. Okay, I will now begin. It was the man from Records who began it, him all unknowing, in his prim, grim way, his above-it-all, old-think way. He was the one Syme called Old Misery. He wasn't truly new to Julia. Fiction, records, and research all took second meal at 1300, so you got to know everyone's face. But up to then, he'd really just been Old Misery, the one who looked like he'd swallowed a fly, who coughed more than he spoke. Comrade Smith was his right name, though comrade never fitted him somehow. Of course, if you felt foolish calling someone comrade, far better not to speak to them at all. He was slight and very fair, good-looking, or might have been if he hadn't always looked so sour. You never saw him smile, unless it was the false smirk of party piety. Julia made the error of smiling at him once, and got back a look that could sour milk. People said he excelled at his job, but couldn't advance because his parents had been unpersons. One supposed that made him bitter. Nonetheless, it was a shame how Syme tormented him. At the Ministry of Truth, Syme worked in research, devising newspeak words. These were meant to purify everyone's mind, but were mainly a pain in the arse to learn. Most folk muddled along, but Old Misery Smith couldn't even say "ungood" without looking as if it scalded his mouth. Syme saw in this a reason to follow him around and act like his best friend, the better to pepper him with newspeak terms and watch the fellow squirm. Smith also hadn't the stomach for public executions, so Syme would talk about the hangings he'd witnessed, making the noises of the strangling men and saying how he enjoyed it when their tongues lolled out. Smith turned positively green. That was the sort of fun Syme liked. Julia had spoken to the man just once, when they'd got stuck together at a table in the canteen. She'd still harbored hopes for him then. There were so few attractive men at Truth, and she'd thought she could nurse a crush on Smith to while away a tedious day. So she'd chattered with more warmth than was warranted about the new 3-year plan, and how fiction had luckily got new workers, all praise to Big Brother, and how his records bearing up. Instead of answering, he'd said, not meeting her eye, "So you work on one of the fiction machines?" She'd laughed. "I fix whatever breaks, comrade. It's not just one machine. That would be a fine machine, one you had to fix all day. I always see you with a spanner." His eyes went to the red junior anti-sex league sash at her waist, then darted away hastily as if he'd had an electric shock. Then she'd seen the silly blighter was afraid of her. He thought she was about to report him for sex crime, as if she could see whatever filthiness he had cooking in his head. Well, there wasn't much point after that. They had finished their meal in silence. The day it changed was the morning O'Brien was in fiction, a low April morning of evil winds, when all London rattled and moaned and seemed about to blow down around its own ankles. With O'Brien in, fiction was a madhouse, everyone showing off how hard they could work. But Julia's side dried up. She spent the whole morning up on the walkway, watching in vain for the yellow flags that meant someone needed a repair. Normally they sprouted like weeds, and Julia was dashing about all day to a refrain of, "Comrade, it's making a rattle. Oh, it's not doing it now. Could you just check?" Most service requests were just an excuse to sneak out for a chat and a gin. And Julia always played her part, shutting down the machine and pretending to hunt for the source of the phantom problem. Today, not a rattle in the house. Everyone was too afraid of being taken for a saboteur by O'Brien. Julia spent the morning pacing the walkway, gasping for a fag, but knowing all it wanted was a cigarette for her to look criminally idle. Fiction was a vast and windowless factory floor that took up the first 2 basement stories of the Ministry of Truth. The space was dominated by the plot machinery, 8 mammoth machines that looked like simple boxes of shining metal. When you opened them up, their guts were a bewildering array of sensors and gears. Only Julia and her colleague Essie knew how to crawl around inside without doing damage. The central mechanism was the kaleidoscope. It had 16 sets of claws that selected and transported plot elements. Hundreds of metal sorts that were grabbed and discarded until a group was found that fit together. This successful pattern was assembled, again by machinery, on a magnetized plate. The plate was dipped into a tray of ink, then swiveled out and was stamped onto a roll of paper. The printed length of paper was cut away. A production manager lifted it free. The result was a gridded print, jocularly called a bingo card, that coded the elements of a story: genre, main characters, major scenes. A rewrite man had once attempted to explain to Julia how these were interpreted, but to no avail. Even after 5 years on the floor, to her they might as well have been East Asian picture writing. Now she watched as a production manager snatched a new print off the roll and waved it about to dry the ink. When he was satisfied, he rolled it, inserted it into a green cylinder, and shoved the cylinder into a pneumatic tube. From up on the walkway, Julia could watch the cylinder's flight through a tangle of translucent plastic hoses on the ceiling to plop into a bin at the southern end of the room. That was rewrite, where men and women sat in long rows, muttering into speak rights, turning bingo cards into novels and stories. But by that stage, no machines were involved, and Julia's interest was at an end. She was perpetually fascinated by the plot machinery, how it worked and the ways it could go wrong. She knew how the inks were formulated and loved to explain why the blue gave trouble. She knew how the paper was held steady and what could make it bunch up or crease. She was excruciatingly aware of when a part would soon need replacing, and knew how to submit the order so it wouldn't get knocked back by the Capital Goods Committee. But about the books that were the end result, she knew little and cared less. Once a rewrite chap told her he was the same, having formerly been a voracious reader. "People say if you love sausage, you should never see it being made. It disgusts you after that. That's me in books." For Julia, this dictum wasn't true of sausage. She'd made and eaten sausage without a second thought. She'd even eaten sausage raw once to win a bet. but it was true of Revolution's Victory, All for Big Brother, or War Nurse 7, Larissa. As she thought this, she realized she'd idly fallen into watching O'Brien. He was working his way around the floor, making impromptu speeches, asking questions, smiling genially at everyone. In the regions far from him, the workers kept their heads down and their faces blank. They were doing their best machine imitation, which in many cases was impressively good. Close to O'Brien, however, all faces turned to him, alive with timid hope, like flowers turning to the sun. Several people had been coaxed from their posts and were gathered by him, listening raptly to whatever he was saying. Of course, an inner party member's chit-chat always took precedence over your job. From Julia's vantage point on the walkway, what was most striking was the physical contrast between O'Brien and his listeners. O'Brien wore jet black inner party overalls of thick American cotton that fit so well they must have been tailored. Everyone else was outer party and wore blue rayon overalls, either too tight or comically voluminous. After one wearing, the rayon bagged at the knees. After 20, the knees grew thick with darning. The dye came out in the wash, so every pair was a slightly different blue, and blotchy where the color had faded unevenly. O'Brien was tall and powerfully built, while the fiction people were either painfully scrawny or pot-bellied. They hunched in the permanent cringe of the meek, while O'Brien was a straight-backed, bull-like man. One kept fancying his big hands scarred across the knuckles and his snub nose broken, though in fact he had not a blemish. Then there was his charm. He treated every man like his particular friend and made every girl feel as if she'd caught his eye. All sham, of course, yet you couldn't help liking him. He reminded Julia of a moving picture she'd seen where an inner party man got stranded in Second Agricultural Region and ended up saving the harvest. Only he could see that the trouble with the corn was a tiny insect devouring it from the inside. This thanks to his superior intellect, symbolized by the neat eyeglasses he wore on the end of his nose. When it came time to help with the reaping, though, he folded those eyeglasses, put them in his pocket, and his brute strength was the wonder of the peasants. Girls sighed over him, and the laborers roared with laughter at his down-to-earth jokes. O'Brien was just like that, down to the gold-rimmed specs and sighing girls. Even now, Margaret from Julia's hostel had materialized beside him at Machine 4, laughing at whatever O'Brien had said, her cheeks pink, one hand in her sandy hair. Margaret didn't even work in fiction, and had no earthly cause to be here. And behind her were Syme and Ampleforth, both of whom worked with Margaret on the 10th floor. All three must have been alerted to O'Brien's presence and come running. Julia looked away in irritation, for she herself should be chatting up O'Brien. Not for love of his blue eyes, but to see if he wanted any home repairs. Most did. The housing people took forever and never had parts when they finally came. Julia did home repairs for the challenge, so she said, but almost everyone was kind enough to slip her $50. And with the inner party members, it was well worth it, even if they paid nothing. Indeed, it could be better if they paid nothing. That was treating you as a friend. Julia had heard of people getting jobs or flats, thanks to friends of just this type. O'Brien would make the ideal friend. Yet Julia remained on the walkway, her face a mask of dutiful alertness. The thought of approaching the man made her flesh crawl. O'Brien was from love. At that moment, all power was cut to the machines. They whirred and slowed, with a groan like a great beast sighing ponderously and easing its huge bulk down to the ground. In the silence that followed, a funny bone silence, a silence like the deafness after a bomb. The whistle blew for the 2 minute. The whistle blew for the 2 minutes hate. There it goes. I'm ending there, so I had to slug the ending.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And so everyone will get a chance to buy Julia so you can find out what happens. Ed Park is the author of the novels Personal Days and Same Bed, Different Dreams. He is the founding editor of The Believer and has worked in newspapers, book publishing, and academia. His writing appears in The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, Harper's Magazine, The Atlantic, and elsewhere. Born in Buffalo, he lives in Manhattan with his family. Same Bed, Different Dreams was just named finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. It weaves together three distinct narrative voices with an archive of mysterious images, twists reality like a kaleidoscope. Korean history, American pop culture, and our tech-fraught lives come together in this extraordinary and unforgettable novel. From the acclaimed author of Personal Days, Same Bed, Different Dreams is a raucously funny feat of imagination and a thrilling meld of history and fiction that pulls readers into another dimension, one in which utopia is possible. That sounds nice. Kathy Park Hong, author of Minor Feelings, writes, "Genius. Same Bed, Different Dreams is an extraordinary and hilarious genre-busting nesting doll of comedy, science fiction, and thriller, and at its core, an epic compendium of Korean history that's also the dark history of American foreign entanglements. It's like no other novel I've read before." And Elizabeth Mackenzie writes, "No blurb could adequately praise or even sum up this novel. All I know is that Same Bed, Different Dreams belongs in the company of a rare few dark and comedic masterpieces of invention." It was a Publishers Weekly starred book, as well as one of the Publishers Weekly 10 Best Books of the Year, New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and the winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. I'm very excited for you to hear Ed Park read and to talk about his creation of this fantastic novel. Please help me welcome Ed Park.
Thank you. Hey, thank you so much. The pressure's on because Sandy's reading was so good. I was like, maybe I should read from the first page too. But then I looked at the first page and I don't think, well, I don't know. I'm not gonna do that. I will read from something. The problem with this book is that there are the description you gave, the various descriptions you gave make it sound like there's just like so much going on and you can't, get a grip on it. Everything does coalesce and merge. But for reading, even a 20-minute reading, it's hard to kind of give the full picture. So I'm just going to read from a chapter kind of late in the book that you don't really have to know anything, just that one of the characters whose name is her name is Daisy O. She has appeared earlier in kind of a modern present day chapter, and she's a translator in like 2016. But here, this chapter is called Amsterdam in the 80s, and it takes place in 2009. So I will read from that for a little bit. What's that? What page? Oh, to read along, sure. It's page 363. 363 it's like chapter 14 or 15, chapter 16. All right, so I'll read a bit. I don't know if I'll make the 20-minute mark, but I'll do my best. Okay. "Lay it on me, Days," says Mel. I'm still formulating my thoughts. Daisy O is at a loss. She has scrupulously read her friend Melinda's screenplay, but would have trouble drumming up a précis. Problems commence with the title, When in Rome, implying that the movie will unfold there, but it's just a phrase that the characters spout. Most of it is set in the Gowanus neighborhood of Brooklyn. Daisy genuinely likes Mel. They met in freshman bio at Penumbra College when both entertained comical pre-med thoughts. By the third week, they'd dropped the class, the last science either would take. And by senior year, they were housemates in a leaky Victorian off campus. These days, she doesn't understand her friend's overriding desire to write a screenplay, just as people have stopped going to the movies. Somehow, I thought all the characters would end up in Rome, Daisy says. No, it's just an expression. It means you follow the custom of wherever you are. I know what it means. When they first met, Melinda confused Daisy with another girl, Nayan, who'd grown up in Seoul. A lot of people mixed them up, and in truth, they did look similar. Even after Nayan shaved her head, though, the confusion remained. So some things weren't worth getting upset about. Part of me thinks there are too many characters, Melinda says, and Daisy nods. There are far too many, with names that sound alike. Molly and Sally, Carson and Carter. There's a Rachel and a Rachel AEL, something Daisy only untangled on a second read. Maybe I should start from scratch. Well, the ending is very strong, Daisy assures her. It's hard to describe exactly. This is true. The end of When in Rome is a speech about artisanal sherry, being present for others, and the charms of Gowanus. The monologue is unleashed by a character named Milton. Who? Milton? Daisy suspects he's really Molly or Rachel AEL, victim of an abandoned search and replace. It's definitely interesting to hear how sherry making went from a cottage industry to a corporate concern in just 9 months. The time it takes for Rachel without an A to conceive and give birth to her daughter Hunter. But maybe the sherry stuff would have worked better as a blog post. Since this is 2009, so people are still writing blogs. Maybe it would have worked better as a blog post. Since moving to New York, Melinda has become a major foodie, keeping tabs on the best Ecuadorian, getting seltzer delivered by the oldest continually working beverage delivery woman in the city. Their iced coffees look khaki. Seagulls walk the pier, on the lookout for fallen fries. It's an arid early summer day. Melinda's in a bone white blouse with a Peter Pan collar, buttons big as Necco wafers. Daisy would never wear a shirt like that. Melinda's the kind of person who will keep wearing something until it becomes not just acceptable, but inevitable, like a uniform. A new tattoo peeks out from her left sleeve, another Chinese character. Daisy takes When in Rome out of her bag. Melinda opens it like a mom checking a diaper. She faces a sea of carrots and octothorpes and tails lashing typos away to the margin. Daisy has corrected for grammar and spelling, with queries done in her spiky, near cuneiform hand. She's a copy editor at Gazebo, the magazine of high-end lawn furnishings. It was the only job she could find after graduating. Daisy tells friends she's happy to look something over, but she wonders if that's true. The screenplay is full of mistakes, and she thinks less of Melinda for it. The problem with being a good copy editor is that the world will always be in error. A little bit more. Later, alone, Daisy walks the newly opened High Line, a park built on a stretch of old elevated railroad on the west side. Strangely shaped buildings rise around her like alien crystal formations, busted concertinas. What would it be like to live in one? She would stroll the High Line every day, find out the names of the butterflies and the different kinds of plant life, the titles of the weird art that's not exactly her taste, but that she would learn to like. But to afford a place here, she needs to marry rich or get into a different field. More school? No. Maybe she should be writing a screenplay too. It can't be that difficult. You just need a strong point of view. There are stories everywhere you look. The trick is to pay attention. Inspired, Daisy heads east to 6th Avenue and decides to follow the first interesting person she sees, study every detail. This person will provide the basis for her main character. It's an exercise she learned from a writing class back at Penumbra called Intro to Wild Word. Each day, you tried a new style or technique. The net effect was that it made her not want to be a writer. Waiting to cross 6th Avenue is a Japanese hipster wearing a neck brace. Daisy scribbles down a description on an old Duane Reade receipt. Stringy mustache, tinted glasses, crisp tan blazer over distressed Thin Lizzy t-shirt, merce made of tarp from a decommissioned military truck. Little does he suspect his future appearance in a critically acclaimed film. Daisy trails him, imagining his life, what he's doing so far from Tokyo, his family, his diet. Maybe he is a video game designer. No, too stereotypical. She decides he came to New York with the dream of becoming a salsa dancer, but then got injured doing a particularly difficult move and needs to stabilize his neck. But she sees it's not a brace, but one of those inflatable pillows for long flights. Fashion statement or narcolepsy precaution? Perhaps he isn't a hipster at all, simply a bum. He walks to 34th, heads into the subway, and he gets on a downtown too, and Daisy follows, sitting obliquely across. She idly reads a new scene Melinda gave her at lunch. One of the Rachels is trampling grapes while a baby-faced VC watches, eating Twizzlers, murmuring sleazy encouragement. Daisy peers up from this lurid scenario to spy on her quarry. He leans back, one cheek resting on the neck pillow. His eyes close. Daisy takes more notes. Jet lag? There's a fantastic amount of cat hair on his black skinny jeans. It's hard to penetrate the inner core of this guy. She writes inner core, question mark, question mark, question mark, on the receipt. In the tiny space left, she sketches his face. When she tries to fix the nose, everything goes downhill. It looks like how a psychic might draw Jack the Ripper. The doors open on 14th Street and he darts out. Daisy follows. This is the stop closest to her office, and being in the vicinity on a weekend makes her surly. As he vaults up the stairs, something drops out of his merce. Wait, she calls, but he's already booking down the pavement. By the time she attains the mystery object, the hipster's long gone. It's a thumb drive, about 2 inches long, free of markings. She drops it in her tote, then heads back down to catch a train uptown. All right. So that's usually as much as I read, but I'll read a couple. Yeah, but let's see. I mean, Sandy like stopped on a cliffhanger. Maybe I should do this. Yeah, so it's like 200 pages later. You're all asleep. You're all in a nice frame of mind. All right, I'll just read it's kind of like a fun party scene, but I don't know if I love party scenes in books. I'll read a little bit of the party scene, I think. All right. Now I've built it up. I'm not saying this is a amazing party scene, but all right. Okay, so a little bit before she gets to the party, out of the subway at last, Daisy flips open her phone. Remember, this is 2009. Not everyone has a smartphone. It's a flip phone. The day is even hotter than before. Above, AC units drip in a parody of rain. She's missed a call from Max, her invisible boyfriend. They met in biology, but didn't date till senior year when she liked him more than he liked her. They broke up after graduation, but now he says he wants her back. It's terrible, but she's kind of forgotten what he looks like. The balance of power has shifted. He emails that he needs her. She writes the same thing back, but without a period or exclamation point, as if lack of punctuation offers an escape hatch. Because she doesn't know if she needs him, honestly. It's hard for her to see a future with Max. In fact, it's hard for her to see him at all. After taking a few years off, Max didn't get accepted to a medical school in New York City, which was a blow. He didn't get accepted to a medical school in the state or even the country. Instead, he's doing a program in Guadalajara, Mexico. He promised to be in New York this summer, but then got offered a plum research position in Buenos Aires, looking into the causes of benign positional vertigo. In 2 weeks, he'll be moving farther south. At this rate, Daisy figures he'll wind up at that scientific encampment in Antarctica, wearing one of those huge orange parkas with fur trim. I don't know. It's kind of funny. I forgot I'd written that. All right. So let's do just a little bit of this party, and I'll leave it on a cliffhanger. So if you want to know more. All right. At a party the next night on her friend Loa's roof, she talks to Sang, who works for a nonprofit that makes sure every child in New York has safe drinking water. But doesn't New York already have the best tap water in the world? Daisy asks. She had seen it on TV once as a girl. I don't know, maybe, Sang says. I'm more on the modeling side of things. You're a model? He gives her a look. Of course, he means data modeling. She blushes with embarrassment. It's like the time when she thought a friend was getting a job as an iBanker, spelled EYE, like one's eyes. Okay, it was funnier in 2009. Daisy's been talking to Sang for 5 minutes, but already she's noticed that whenever an attractive woman walks by, he rakes his hair with his fingers and yawns. It's like a poker player's tell. Did he do that when Loa introduced her to him 5 minutes ago? Would be interesting to know. What do you do? He asks. I'm a copy editor at Gazebo, she says. To her surprise, Sang nods. My mom subscribes. This is the first time Daisy has met a civilian who will admit familiarity with the magazine. This makes her like him, even though she distrusts Gazebo's readership. Every so often, she'll field a call from an outraged subscriber venting about the surfeit of postal reply cards. What's her gazebo like? She asks, the question sounding like lost jazz age innuendo. Funny story. She's always wanted one, but my dad says it's too dangerous. Apparently, Sang's father refuses to get a gazebo because he thinks it will collapse while they are eating berries and cream. He's a little OCD, Sang says, blinking, but so am I. It's a common fear, Daisy agrees. The gazebo taps into a rich vein of fantasy. People think lightning will strike or that a murderer is going to pop up behind you wielding scissors. You should read our letters column. Where's she even going with this? Sang asks Daisy what she did before gazebo. She says a little bit of this, a little bit of that. She says school. She says she was a humanities major, even though, quote, I hate humans. He blinks some more. Is that about 20 minutes? Okay, I'll stop there. Okay. So find out about the thumb. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. Will you two come up here and sit in these big comfy chairs so you can ask each other some questions, and then our audience can ask you some questions, and you just have to speak into the mic.
I'll ask Sandy first. Or should we be closer? I sense this chasm between us. So I actually I hadn't read 1984 in a long time, maybe even since high school, but I did look at it a couple years ago when one of my kids was reading it for school, and I was just, I mean, there are things you read in high school that you kind of have to read and they leave an impression, but I'd forgotten how, involving and engrossing the story was. And I'm curious, how did you decide to write Julia and take that as, take that character and show us a different side?
It's a really easy answer because I was asked to write the book by the Orwell estate. So
What was it? What was your contact with them? How did they just read some of your other work and called you up?
yeah, essentially, I mean, from my side, my phone rang when I had just woken up in the morning. So I'm in bed in my pajamas, and it's my agent asking me if I want to write this book. And she had essentially she'd had lunch with the agent who represents the Orwell estate. And he was complaining because 1984 was about to come out of copyright. And many, many people have wanted to write this book, a book of 1984 from the point of view of Julia over the years. And he is incredibly fussy about Orwell's legacy. He's actually notorious for this. Like, it's interesting. Like, I have actually just randomly heard references to this in the wild since being involved in this project. And now that 1984 was coming out of copyright, he was not going to be able to tell people no anymore. So he was in distress, and he had already asked one person, I don't know who it was. I like to think it was Hilary Mantel because he also represented her, and who said no, who didn't want to write it.
It's the agent representing the Orwells.
Yeah. So he had asked one person, and he was complaining to my agent, and she said, well, why don't you ask Sandra? And he knew my work, and he said, oh yes, that's an idea. And so they approached me, and I wrote an outline into first chapter. So, and it was one of those things, like, you wake up in the morning and somebody calls you and it's like, am I still dreaming? Is this real? And I wasn't sure I could do it, but I immediately wanted to do it. I am one of those people who, like, when I was 20, I read every work of Orwell's, and it altered me politically forever and so on. So,
did you have a book already underway of your own that you had to put aside, or a project or were you kind of in a good place to accept the offer immediately? Like, did you have to put your own work aside?
that's interesting. I was very lucky, and I had finished a book, and I didn't have another one that I had really become involved in. So it was just lucky in every possible way. Okay, so I have a question for you, because the new book that I'm working on now is the first book that I've written that is intentionally supposed to be a comedy. So I have problems with this that I hope you'll sort out for me. And one of my main problems is that I really worry about having serious things happen in a book that is pitched as comedy. Like, did you ever have any problems with things that just seemed tragic or traumatic that happened, and you had to work around them with the tone?
You mean serious things that I want to put in the book, but then I'm also trying to do comedy, and how do I reconcile? Yeah.
If you're writing something that's sort of like a joke a minute,
Yeah.
and then you have somebody lose a child, that's one of the things that happens in my book.
Right.
How do you just end up throwing out the loss of the child, or do you work around it somehow?
I kind of cheat in this book because there's some sections that are like basically pure comedy. I mean, that amazing part that I just read, just like I'm going for the laughs, right? And I think one of the early, kind of the first long chapter of the book, it's like 40-ish pages, and that was like the genesis of the book, and it was just me writing to amuse myself. Like, I didn't know where I was going. I kind of as it got longer, I was like, this isn't a short story, but I'm setting up all these things. But it was like it's like a dinner party where everybody's trying to make each other laugh. I mean, not make each other laugh, but they're comic figures. And then there's a lot of tragic stuff in this book. Some of it having to do with one of the narrators, some of it having to do and kind of a lot of it connected to war, particularly the Korean War, and some episodes in kind of modern Korean history. And so a lot of those sections are in a certain thread of the book called the dreams, which are not without humor, but it was definitely like humor was not goal number one. So I kind of wanted to get certain episodes down as powerfully as I could, but there was, I guess, a bit of sense of irony maybe rather than laugh out loud humor. But I was trying to think also of just, and my first novel, Personal Days, was much more just, it was just kind of dark comedy the whole way through, with, I guess the serious aspect was, getting fired from a job really can be traumatic, right? So it's like, how do you it was kind of like wrapping that somewhat common trauma, I guess, in comedy and humor, trying to make the workplace as funny I can. But I was thinking about, kind of related to Orwell. So his friend Anthony Pohl, I don't know if you're a fan of his, but he actually, they were like politically kind of opposite sides of the spectrum, but they became very close. And I believe the Pohl hosted his memorial when Orwell died. But Anthony Pohl's first novel is called Afternoon Men, and it's one of the, I just think it's a brilliant comedy. It's from the, I think it was 29 that it came out, and still really funny. And something happens in that book that it's like, I don't want to spoil it, but you kind of like, a very serious thing happens and you're kind of stunned, and then it just like somehow he gives it enough space for that to sink in and then just picks up the comedy again. It's a really weird but very effective thing he does. And there are probably other examples, but that's actually what came to mind when you asked that question. So yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah.
And your book.
Okay, yeah, that's it. But I mean, in a way, like Pohl's work, I mean, that book and kind of this book, Dance to the Music of Time, which is his long kind of sequence. Like when I said I liked parties, parties and books, and in real life sometimes, but just like that's kind of a model for for me in terms of like writing party scenes. And I don't know if you have party scenes or if you will have party scenes, but it's a good way to put some humor there, I think. Yeah. Should we keep just talking, or did you want to?
Yeah, I think we should probably.
Yeah, or questions from the audience, or
I have one
yeah.
question. It's a follow-up question to what you asked, Ed, for Sandra. After I read Julia, I went back and reread 1984. And like you, I hadn't read it for many, many years. And I was just so struck by the structure of Julia and 1984 and how you authentically kept to everything that happened, but then, gave us Julia's perspective of everything. I mean, there were other ways that you could have done it, and it just was so impressive the way you kept to the exact structure of the book. And I was just wondering, craft wise, how you came to that decision, and if there's anything else you might want to add about doing something so closely to another piece of literature that's already been written, and advice along those lines, maybe.
Okay. No, it's interesting. I started after I was offered the job. I started reading 1984 again. Obviously, I'd actually read it 2 times before, and I was reading it thinking, well, how can I write this book? And I did think at first, you could, because they didn't give me any particular like rules. They didn't say that I should do this or that. It could have followed on after 1984 and started from the year 1985. There was no particular reason to do one thing or another. But I very quickly established in my own head that to me it was just like ruining everything if you didn't approach the same story from the different point of view. Like the point of it is to tell the story from the other point of view and somehow transform it enough that it's a completely new story, while also have it be related to the old story enough that people who remember the old story are thinking, oh my God, so that's what that meant. Or, oh, of course it would look like that to her. Or that's what, that's how Winston looks from the outside in this situation. And a lot of it, like a lot of the fun of the book for me was in the scenes where I would be using all the same dialogue, like all of Orwell's dialogue, word for word. And I would just have to, I mean, for one thing, some of his dialogue for Julia isn't that stellar. Like, honestly, like to be completely honest, it's not always that perfect. And one thing that he does that drove me absolutely around the bend was that he does not use contractions in his dialogue. So people are always saying, I do not believe, things like that. So I would just have to repeat that word for word and grit my teeth. But the other things that he makes Julia like almost improbably loathsome in some ways. And I had to like figure out reasons that she would do these things while still being a sympathetic character who we could identify with. And usually, like a typical thing that I have is that she's just kind of teasing him and he takes it seriously. Like there's a famous moment in 1984 where he's talking about a time when he fantasized about murdering his wife. And she immediately essentially says, "Oh, well, why didn't you? I would have." And he takes it completely seriously and says, well, you know, essentially, well, yes, I would now. I realize I would now. And I thought, well, if that's me, I wouldn't have meant it. She's just testing him. She's trying to see what his tolerances are. And in the original, in 1984, Winston's always relating to her as if, having just met him, she's being completely honest and open with him and not at all managing him. And I just thought, this is a woman who's alone with a man in an extremely unsafe situation all the time. So of course she's managing him and she's not being completely on the level with him. And she's trying to keep him sweet the entire time. So I guess that's maybe either a partial answer or a too full answer or both.
So I have a question from the craft side. Did you both write chronologically? Because I imagine such a gigantic undertaking would be difficult to go back through and rewrite. But I'm so curious, especially Ed, I can't imagine how you did that. Because they're so different and they still affect each other. So did you have to rehaul if in revision?
I guess the short answer is that there was like a very long first draft that most of which I had to throw out, but that was pretty much linear in terms of like it started at this now mythical dinner party that I keep referencing at the beginning of the book, and it was just like the main narrator, kind of going through his life, and different characters move in and out, and it goes for several months. I can't remember how many chapters, and it was very long, and it just didn't seem to be working. And I think also as I was writing it, I was just getting kind of bigger ideas about what the book was actually about. One thing was, I think in your introduction, you mentioned like Korean history and this idea of there was already the idea of a book within the book in the novel, and like several years in, I was like, oh wait, I think the book within the book will be kind of a novel about Korean history. And so then I was doing that, and it was sort of linear, but also not, because my mind was just kind of like, what things do I want to put in? So um, I don't know where I'm going with this. It was very complicated. And I guess I'll just say, even as things were shaping up, I had to keep typing out or writing out the chronology and the titles of the chapters and which characters were where. It was really, I mean, it was, I guess now I'm happy I did it, but like in the middle of it, I would have these giant Post-its. Have you ever seen these giant, they're like Post-its, but they're this big, and I just keep slapping them on the wall and like try to keep everything neat. And then soon there would be arrows like indicating, this person has to also appear there. And so yeah, I guess it wasn't a chronological process for me. Think about that.
Okay, I have an answer that will start out being different and wind up in the same place, I think. So I tend to be like an author. I'm really uptight about starting at the beginning, and I have to have chapter 1 perfect before I can move on to chapter 2. But at the same time, there were also flashback sections. There are flashbacks to Julia's childhood. So those I kind of wrote separately and ended up having to find a place for them. And then the third thing is that while I'm writing everything in this kind of everything begins at the beginning and we move through, and until the beginning is perfect, we can't move on. I also have always like, I start with one outline file. So this is like your giant Post-it. I start with one outline file, but then I start, like, and I've got like chapter 1, like straight through to the end often, even from the very beginning. But then I get ideas while I'm writing the outline. So I begin to fill up these things, and like maybe chapter 15 begins to be really bulky. So it's like 3 pages long. And then I'm like, and eventually the outline file is like 25 pages long, and I can't find anything in it anymore. So I start another file, which is typically named just an outline. And then by the end, I might have gone through 15 of these, and I'm working in a file that's called For the Love of Christ, just an outline. And it again begins to get weird and bulky and impossible to find anything, but hopefully by then I'm at the end of the book. And so that's more or less the process.
All right, thanks. So I'm a journalist, so my antennae, whatever they are, went up when you said that, when you told us the story about how the book came about and the Orwell estate basically agreeing to have you do it. Did I get it right that the agent for the Orwell estate is a man? I think you said he, right? Okay. So, and you also said that they did not have preconceived ideas about exactly how you were supposed to do the book or structure it. Okay. So am I getting this right, that this guy did not presume to know what Julia was thinking and was leaving it for you to sort of figure that out? Or did he have any ideas about what it is that Julia was thinking when she was having this relationship with Winston? I mean, I'm not asking this question facetiously at all. It's just very refreshing if it's true.
Yeah, I'm able to say, yes, it is just as refreshing as you might imagine. The only thing that Bill Hamilton is his name. And he's like the most British of people. In fact, he's just retiring. So he's from another era of British males. So you would think that he would be very controlling and difficult. And he did show some signs of like being possessive of Orwell and wanting his version to come out tops. But really, he restrained that heroically. And the only thing that he always said to me was that he needed to know, and he had never been able to understand, what Julia saw in Winston that made her want to sleep with him. And I worked really hard to address that issue. By the end, like he was semi-convinced, but he still hard to believe. Yeah, he was still relying on, I mean, maybe he thought, like, I don't understand why women sleep with these men. And I was trying to explain to him, Bill, have you ever had a boring job and just had a crush on a coworker because there was nobody else? But apparently he hadn't. He'd just been a literary agent all his life. So he didn't know, what it was like to be that bored so that was basically it. But yeah, he was just as good as gold in every other respect.
Well, first, I was just going to say that my favorite type of literature is point of view manipulation. I just think it's so fun. So I haven't read your book, but now I'm very excited too. I just love when you look at one, like Ahab's Wife or As I Lay Dying or Poisonwood Bible or whatever, where you're looking at one thing from different angles is, I just think, super fascinating. Like to think about how, like the example you just gave, why would she do this? Like Orwell didn't tell me, but a different writer could. So that's really neat. And the other thought I had was, Ed, for you, when you were talking about Sandra's question about the humor, it seems, I also have not read your book either. So I teach here and I just love coming to these readings. And so I usually leave with books and don't anyway. It seems like your narrator is sort of breaks the fourth wall a bit, right? He's talking very much to us more than sort of the general reader. It feels very personal. And it seemed like, again, all I know is what you read, but it seemed to me like he sort of, you can address serious things with that humor because he's like, he's responsible for it. Like, so maybe he's the guy, he doesn't take it as seriously. I'm not sure if I'm articulating myself very well, but like sort of like the fall guy or whatever. Like he's not the most sensitive guy in the world, but or whatever. So he's making a joke about this, but this is still a serious topic. I was just curious if your other book is similar, if you are drawn to that type of narrator.
I mean, so how can I say this? So the book has like almost every kind of narration you can imagine. So there's one chapter that's in the second person, there's one that's like a interview, there's straight first person. The thing I read was kind of like I guess a close third. And then there are these big chapters that are like first first person plural. And it wasn't like I'm gonna do every kind of narration there is. It just, I think part of it is if something wasn't working, I was like, there's some energy that comes with like doing another thing. And I think part of it is also to talk about what you're asking about humor, just like sometimes I'm able to get to the funny stuff if it's done in a format that surprises me as a writer. Yeah, I would also say like it's with that, the part that I just read, I feel like there's enough space, hopefully the dialogue is funny enough, but then there's a little bit of space where I guess it's sort of through the protagonist's, filtered through her, what she sees and stuff. But, that's also where I can do a little bit of editorializing and kind of like shape it to be a little funnier. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Did your editor ever say, what's up with the narration?
Thankfully, no. I was worried about that, but
Freedom with that.
yeah. Thanks.
I'm just wondering, they say that one of the most difficult things a historian has to do is decide which details go into their book or not, especially as you're doing research and there's all these different things. And I'm wondering, with Same Bed, Different Dreams, given how closely and intimately you deal with Korean history, particularly through the insertion of, specific historical figures or, like almost name dropping sometimes, but how do you maintain your stories, primacy? Like, how do you prevent your novel from becoming subservient to the context while still making it close? I suppose this could work for Julia too. How do you make a story that's, its own sovereign thing and doesn't just become an Easter egg hunt for details from Orwell's original work?
That's a great question. I think I would say that I didn't know that I was writing a historic, like I wouldn't like call this a historical novel, but there's a ton of history in it. And I don't know that, I guess, let me backtrack a second. So I mentioned this first draft that was like very long, just one, first person, single narrator, and I went on and on. And when I realized that the book also had to be about these aspects of Korean history. So the Korean War, but also like kind of the Japanese occupation of Korea in early 20th century. And there were certain figures, whether they're, writers, politicians, artists, spies, who I had read about, and I was like, I want them in my book. Like, I don't care about primacy. And I also felt like most people, even most Koreans, like are not really familiar with them. So some of it is stuff maybe my dad told me, some of it is my own reading. And I just figured also, as the book was getting longer and my time with the book was getting so long, I was like, this is gonna be my only chance to like talk about these people. I may never write another book. So I just kind of, I guess I would say I just tried to make it interesting. I just try to make it like something like we could be having dinner and I want to tell you about something interesting that happened. And so it was almost like I was trying to hold the reader's interest by, you'll also notice like those chapters, they're like done in these numbered sections that are quite short. So almost like I wanted to get the important, interesting stuff across. And that's also how I trick myself into writing a historical novel, because it's like, I'm not really writing one. I'm just putting these 100 bullet points, and but then they kind of gather their own momentum and integrity, and that's kind of how it happened. So it was the realization that it was working that was really like, kind of a big moment for me in writing the book.
Yeah, that's great. Great answer. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I mean, with this book, I already knew what had to be in it in a way. And a lot of it was whatever Orwell left out, I had to do. And so but then you have to come up with an excuse for it within the plot. You have to have some reason that it's in there. It's like you're talking about figures from Korean history who you want to include. Well, then you need something that ties them in and something that makes them part of the plot. And that can sometimes seem like an impossible task, but I find personally that as soon as you tell yourself that there's going to be an answer, then your mind just works on it, and then you come up with the answer, and then you think, oh, what a clever boy am I, essentially. and it's all good. But you do have to do it, is the thing. And I know I've become quite good at it over the years, I think, of coming up with some cheat that ties whatever I want to talk about into the actual plot. But I know somebody who is unbelievably good at coming up with premises and then can't think of a story that goes with the premises. And it's just heartbreaking. And I somehow can't put what I can do into, yeah.
I wanted to go back to your mention, Ed, particularly both of you really, of loving writing about parties. Because I've always heard that that's one of the hardest things to do. And I, of course, want to know all your tips, but I also wanted to ask you specifically, when you do parties, do you kind of airdrop in new characters and then pull them back out again, or are they for sort of some of the main characters? I'm sure they're a mixture, but that's what I always hear is very hard.
So the big party at the beginning, and there was we got a little party in the scene I read. The big party in the beginning, it was almost like there was no book. It was just me writing. Like there was nothing. So I was just introducing these people, and each one kind of had to earn their keep. Like they had to be wearing something interesting or say something, scandalous, or, there were, and as each one, I think there are 14 people at this party, which is maybe too many. It's like a dinner party. It's like a literary dinner party. And I mean, the one thing I knew was that it would be for a visiting novelist from Korea. So in real life, I'd been invited to a publication party for this very esteemed Korean author, and I was like the only one who went. And I just always remember, and this guy's a genius. And so, but this was years ago when I was still like in newspapers. But I just thought like, so that would be the main guy, and then the narrator would be, kind of an Ed Park like character, just to keep things simple. And I would change the biography later. But then each person that I added, they would have to, it was almost like they had to bring something to the party, if that makes sense. And then I guess the other thing I would say is like, I set it, on at a Korean restaurant on 32nd Street. So there's like a lot of Korean food. So they could talk, people could say stuff about the food. Yeah. Oh, yes. No, they actually sorry. Yeah, that's the important point. So I was introducing they're coming into my mind. I'm putting them on the paper. And then from that point, like one of the reasons the book is so long is there's so many people at that party, and I had to like, not all of them. Some of them just kind of have cameos throughout. And I mean, you brought up Easter eggs. Like some of them they're kind of like Easter egg type things where it's like the very sharp reader will be like, oh, that person was actually there. But most of them, for example, Daisy, the main character I was reading about, like she's the translator of that novel, that visiting novelist. but she kind of plays different roles at different points in her life. The narrator, the kind of Ed Park like guy, like he, he has different roles as the story goes on. So it was kind of, I don't know if I recommend this as a method, but it is, I don't know. But on the other hand, like there was something about all fiction is you're making up stuff, right? So how are you going to make up all these people? And it just felt natural in that sense. And also, as long as I was having fun with them, I kind of, my hope was that the reader would be enjoying that as well. So
Yeah, I'm going to bounce off of that. I think this book does have party scenes in it, but they're not party scenes where you have to remember any of the characters. So that's a totally different thing. But I do the last book that I was here with, The Heavens, that begins with a party scene, and it's very similar kind of thing. And I think like one of the things that's interesting is whether the characters are going to appear again. And if they're going to appear again, then you need to have the reader actually remember all of them. So you need to do something like with 14 characters, that's a lot, to make each of them memorable enough and distinct enough that you remember them. But then if they're not going to appear again, you have to somehow signal to the reader that you don't need to remember this guy. So either way, it's something that you have to think about. And then also like when everyone is talking at once, that's a whole other kind of hell, but also really rewarding when it works.
When you start writing, do you have like an overarching theme beside the narrative, like philosophical orientation about the book, about the ideas that you will approach?
Yeah. I always do, and I end up with a bunch of them, and somehow just by I don't usually consciously like write things that go with the theme. So like the theme comes out of whatever I'm writing, and I think, oh yes, this is what it's about, and then I'll make a note at the top of my current draft and I then discovered to my consternation that there are already 3 such notes about what the entire book is about. But somehow it works in the end, and it does feel like it's about all these things. And inevitably, after the book is published, somebody says, oh, I read your book, and it's, I just loved how it was about this thing that I'd never thought of. And I'm like, oh my God, it's actually about that. So
I don't know. I feel like for me it was more gradual. Like with my first book, it was like write about an off, that was what I was going to do. It was going to be about an office and work politics and work friendships and things like that. With this one, I suppose even in that party scene, like the idea of like, I guess I kept thinking about that Korean novelist who came to this lunch where nobody, I was like the only person, but like maybe just by placing him there, I knew that it would somehow be about, it has something to do about Korea. So my first book had nothing to do about Korea. It was just about workplace, and people didn't even have last names. It was kind of like, I mean, that was part of like the effect or the mood. And so this one was like all the many thoughts about Korea I've had over the years. Despite, I wasn't born there, I can barely speak it, but I've had these thoughts both from my experiences, but also just like my reading. And at a certain point, I guess early on, I think I realized that would be, one of the main driving forces of putting together this book. Sure. Yeah. Oh, okay. So there's a whole other thread that well, there's a character who I didn't you haven't heard about, but named Parker Jotter, who is he's a veteran of a Korean War veteran. He's black. He's from Buffalo. We kind of see him after the war running an appliance store. So one of the writers I've admired and read a lot of is Philip K. Dick, and a lot of his characters like work in appliance stores and electronic stores. So it's kind of like a little bit of that. And I was also thinking of actually two Black science fiction writers, Samuel Delany and Octavia Butler. They were on my mind. There were, Black servicemen in the Korean War, and I thought that was interesting. But the conceit was that he starts through kind of a convoluted process. He starts writing these kind of science fiction paperbacks for this not a fly-by-night company, but this I made up this publishing company in Boston, and there's a secret organization in the book called the Korean Provisional Government, and they're convinced that this writer Parker Jotter has he was a POW in the North, and they're convinced his books are encoding some kind of great secret about the Korean War, but kind of Korea in general. And he refuses to believe it. But I kind of wanted to have it both ways. So if you actually read between the lines of the things, you can find like unconsciously he's put in stuff. So that was, yeah. Oh, did you read it? Oh, thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Spontaneous. Did you both know the titles before you started? Or when did you come up with them? You might have, Sandra, known Julia from the beginning. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Weasley title. I felt I should come up with something better and more original, but it was the natural title, so we went with it. Yeah.
I think it's very forceful, and I love the way it looks on the cover. Like it's just the A and the 4. It's cool. I guess so. Same bed, different dreams it's like a saying. It's quite popular in Korea, and my memory is that I had never heard of it growing up or anything, but like sometime, in my 20s, my dad wrote it in an email. I can't even remember why, but I just thought, what a great, just like 4 words, and it says so much, right? It's like no matter how well you know each other, you and your spouse or your partner or your friends, everybody has their own secrets and fantasies and visions. So I kind of just carried it in my back pocket. I would occasionally like write a short story, like start a short story, and like maybe the title goes here, and it wouldn't. I even in around 2010 or 11 had written something that I thought would be longer and maybe would have that title, and it didn't. But then, as soon as I was like 20, 30 pages into the party scene, I was like, all right, this gotta be the title. And then I almost like wrote toward the title. So there's like definitely some domestic stuff where the title makes sense. But then I was like, you could also think of like Korea politically as, same bed, different dreams. North and South Korea, like they're the same people, the same language, but completely different, governments right now. So I liked kind of how it worked on both levels, and I finally got to use the title. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This is such a great reading. Thank you. So everyone, thank you for coming. Please buy books. One of the main reasons why we have